darkmyths.org and the Apples Media Group proudly present to you the Lone Gunman Podcast, featuring your host, Rob Clark, where research comes to shine and myths come to die. Stay tuned. Be right there.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the show. This is episode number 174 of the Lone Gunman Podcast, and I'm your humblest of hosts, Rob Clark, here with you today. We're going to be talking about Manny Aguilar, a Cuban refugee, a friend to many of the anti-Castro Cubans and mercenaries, commandos, and we're also going to be talking about Margeurite. So the topics today will be Manny and Marge. Now, before we get into it, I want to check on the swell and see if we have any new swells from the listeners out there. So hang on just 1 second for me. And look, yes we do. Now this is from, I believe, a question that I had out there, but let me play it for you again just so you understand the question, and then we'll listen to some of the answers, because we got two new answers. I believe we already played Caroline's answer, but let's check it out more, just in case. So this was the question again.
Hello folks, Rob Clark here from the Lone Gunman Podcast with today's question of the week. I'm wondering if you folks have any opinion on what might be the most head-scratching piece of evidence related to the JFK assassination. Something that makes you take pause and say, that's interesting, or makes you feel one way or another about evidence in the case, or who the possible suspects might be behind it, or regarding any evidence with the case as well. Thank you in advance. Stay safe, folks. Peace.
There are 1,000 billion million things, but I really want to know how Roscoe White ended up with that photo, the backyard photo.
Okay, I'm pausing Miss Caroline's because I believe we played this on one of the previous shows and answered it. So we'll skip ahead to this one from one of my favorite listeners. Here you go. Let's see if you can guess who this is.
What did the farmer say when he couldn't find his John Deere tractor? Hey, where's my goddamn John Deere tractor? On a serious note, though, Mr. Rob, and thank you for your awesome question, I'm going to say it really gives me pause. The Seymour, the Boone and Weitzman affidavits about the 7.65 Mauser, and the affidavits, I can't remember what they're called now. I'll get back to you when I can. The ones about the 6'5" guy carrying the rifle case up Acker. There in Dallas on the morning of the 22nd. What were those called? They were called affidavits as well, but I can't remember what the names were. But anyway, those two things. Yeah, for sure.
So before we play the next one, let me just address Doug's comment, and thank you, Doug, for the joke and the comment. Yeah, I mean, it's something that Roger Craig always maintained, was that the rifle was stamped right there on the barrel, 7.65 Mauser. The Boone and Weitzman affidavits stating this as well are also suspect. I mean, one of the guys was supposed to be a rifle expert who had owned a gun shop before. So it does make you pause. Now, of course, the Mauser did resemble the Mannlicher Carcano for sure. And maybe they were just going off of a cursory glance, seeing the bolt action, the general make of the rifle, and mistakenly concurring that it was a Mauser 7.65. But it is odd, that they do say that. And then according to Roger Craig, he states that it was stamped on the barrel. So very odd indeed. Very odd indeed. And the 6'5" guy, Jerry Patrick Hemming, walking down the street with a rifle strapped to his back, also interesting as well. Especially when you put together that one photo of the guy that looks mysteriously like Jerry Patrick Hemming in 1963. The tall guy with crew cut, standing there on Houston Street. Yeah, very interesting stuff. And now we'll go to the next one. This is from Amshart. That is that's a cryptonym for a fart that you let fly a little prematurely and shart yourself. Amshart. Here we go.
The Martin film is very interesting because it tries to link the shooting at General Walker's house with Lee Harvey Oswald and his communist shenanigans on Canal Street.
I agree, Amshart. That is a head scratcher for sure. And I talked a little bit about it. I believe it was either on the Midnight Writers show or no, it was the last one, the Curious Carlos Connections. Because this comment came in before I did my show, which it really makes you wonder. Because again, the film shows one of General Walker's former soldiers flying from Minneapolis, and then it opens up to a scene from Turtle Creek Boulevard and a picture of General Edwin Walker's mailbox, the flag, the window that supposedly had gotten shot. And then cut scene to New Orleans and a street fight between Oswald and Bernier. And when you fast forward a little bit past the assassination and you realize that, okay, before the assassination and before he got shot at, General Walker is associated with Billy James Hargis. And that after the assassination and after it's determined that Oswald had done this by the Warren Commission, and of course, Carlos Bernier was instrumental in painting this guy as a communist, Castro-loving commie. And then to hear that Carlos is employed by Billy James Hargis and doing the same thing him and General Walker were doing before, setting up these talks and meetings and selling their commie literature and riling people up and trying to get donations for raids on Cuba. And you see, at a lot of these bigger speech places, you'll see Bernier and Walker and Hargis all there together. And it just makes you pause for a minute, because it just seems to me like, okay, this guy went to visit General Walker, and he tells him, you need to go to New Orleans and visit this guy named Carlos Bernier. And I think this guy was in New Orleans with Carlos and, hanging out with him. And then either this whole thing was set up with the street fight, or, somebody did come in Carlos's shop and say, hey, there's somebody out here with a sign that said Pro Castro. And, Martin just followed him with the camera and captured it on film. It's just all too much to be coincidental, in my opinion. And obviously Amshart's as well. So thank you guys for the swells Keep them coming. Now, for last week's question of the week, we'll get to that and I'll play it for you.
Hello, folks. Rob Clark here from the Lone Gunman Podcast, a podcast all about the Kennedy assassination. This week it's real simple. Who do you believe was behind the Kennedy assassination and why? Have your voice heard on the show. Thank you. Stay safe. Peace. Hello, folks. Rob Clark here from...
Well, my fault. I did not have an answer to that.
Hello,
yeah,
folks.
I did.
Rob Clark here from the Lone Gunman Podcast. This week's question is very short.
Never mind. Never mind. I thought Caroline had answered, but she had just given it a thumbs up. She did not answer. So, never mind on that. But anyway, if you're interested in having your voice heard on the show, please head to Swell. Well, don't head to Swell. Download the damn app, Swell, and then search for @TLG Podcast or @Quick Hits JFK if you'd like to leave a question for that show over there. The questions of the week will be on the TLG Podcast portion of this. So stay abreast and stay tuned for more questions of the week. Alright. Enough banter and pandering from your boy. Let's get right into it, folks. Now, Manny Aguilar. I will confess, I don't know much about the man. I just know that he was one of Lauren Hall's buddies. I know he was Cuban. I know he was born in 1929. And I know that the 111th Military Intelligence Group was very interested in him. And I'm looking at a Department of Defense notes dossier from September 16th of 1970 in Miami. And there is a lot of stuff in this report that is redacted. But I will try to figure it out. He was interviewed in the hospital at Hialeah, Florida, while convalescing from a ruptured spine. Redacted met Aguilar in 1961 through Felipe Vidal Santiago. Aguilar, also known as Manola or Manny, worked for Raul Castro's right-hand man, a 7-foot-tall Negro named Hector Aldamas. Aguilar approached Redacted in June of 1970 regarding a plan against Cuba, including plot to exfiltrate top GOC officials. A Comar patrol boat jet aircraft claimed to have cells of supporters in Cuba and U.S. believed to be members of Alpha 66, one possible Manola Ray. Others involved, Redacted, a Special Forces captain on reserve in the Miami area, a Sergeant Gilbert, police officer in Opelika, and Second Lieutenant Redacted at Fort Benning. Others who also might know Aguilar are Jose Duarte from Los Angeles, California, Ivan Vidal Santiago, Miami, Lorenzo Hall, William Seymour, and Lawrence Howard. Hemming told Redacted that both Howard and Hall met with LHO in Texas while en route to Florida prior to the JFK assassination. Hemming believed it was a CIA plot. So that's interesting. Now let's move on to the 111th interview of Manny Aguilar. And this interview was conducted by Charles Phillips of the 111th Military Intelligence Group on June 19th, 1970. In regard to training of personnel of the organization, source stated that there was a special force captain by the name of Carl Hickey. So there we have one of the redacted names, who was slated to assist in the training of personnel. Hickey is in a reserve unit in the Miami area. Exact location unrecalled. However, Hickey has called source on at least twice since source has been in the hospital with questions as to when we can get started. Additionally, Hickey has mentioned that he would like to go on a, quote, fishing trip near Cuba, wink wink. However, source and subject have discouraged this since it would, quote, blow the entire operation if a American military type were caught, and would also bring discredit on the U.S. government. Other than Hickey, there are 2 people in Hickey's unit who are also willing to assist and have made their desires known. Source gave the names as follows. Sergeant Gilbert, a reservist who is also a police officer believed to be with the Opelika Police Department, and Second Lieutenant Jose Pujol. Is currently at Fort Benning, Georgia. Source provided the name of Jose Duarte, a one-time head of intelligence for one of the provinces in Cuba under Castro, as a person that can lend credence to the worth of subject. Duarte is the head of an organization called UNAIR, located at P.O. Box 8020, Hollywood, California, and is also the author of a series of books dealing with life in Cuba. Another person knowledgeable of subject's ability is Ivan Vadao Santiago, brother of Felipe Vadao Santiago, who was killed in '64. Ivan is presently located at 731 Southwest 5th Street, Apartment 8, Miami. Ivan also operates a safe house for meetings located at 498 Northwest 23rd Avenue in Miami. Source mentioned, as an aside, that during the buildup of '63, a number of volunteer citizens were making their way across the U.S. into Florida. It was during this time that 3 individuals from California became known within his separate clique. Source supplied the names as follows. Lorenzo Hall from California, William Seymour from Arizona, and Lawrence Howard from California. According to Jerry Hemming, both Howard and Hall met with Lee Harvey Oswald in Texas while en route to Florida prior to the John Kennedy assassination. After Kennedy was killed, Hemming related to source that he felt that the assassination was a Central Intelligence Agency plot to do away with Kennedy, since Howard and Hall were believed to have been connected with the CIA. Source at a later date confronted Howard with the question concerning his part on the alleged connection with the Kennedy assassination. Howard immediately clammed up and became nervous concerning the matter and avoided the subject completely. Additionally, due to Source's long involvement with military-civilian movements against Cuba, a man by the name of Stephen Burton, who presently resides at North Hollywood, California, came to Source's home when he was living in California following the RFK assassination and displayed photographs of Sirhan in efforts to make an identification. Source was unable to make identification but stated that Burton was in the employ of Jerry Hemming at the time. Agent notes Source was completely cooperative during the interview and provided names, addresses, and phone numbers. He appeared to be somewhat self-centered and desired to talk more about himself than subject. As a spot check for accuracy of information concerning individuals, the name and address of Steve Burton, listed above, was checked through the Los Angeles field office of the 115th Military Intelligence Group, and it did list felt sure that the source was being completely truthful in his answers and had strong feelings concerning the abilities of the subject. Now, it was known in advance that Loren Hall had stayed in the house of Manny Aguilar during his visit to Miami in the fall of '63. We went to question Mr. Aguilar about his knowledge of Hall's activities in Miami and otherwise. Mr. Aguilar appears to have very little money and a rather poor house. However, he is a watchmaker by profession and attempted to be very helpful. Our conversation with him lasted a full hour, and the following is the substance of what he told us. Hall, Howard, and Seymour did not actually stay in his house, but spent much time there and ate there. They had a small apartment nearby. These three came to Miami from the West and professed to wishes to fight communism in Cuba. Although Hall was acquainted with both Hemming and Wilson, that's Tom Wilson, they had a falling out, and Hall's group did not get along with Patrick's group. Patrick was a friend of Rolando Masfer, but Hall and Howard were not. It was Hall's plan to attack a place in Cuba where Russians were stationed. He hoped to take a few of them prisoner and bring them back to the United States. When asked where he had met Hall, Aguilar said that he had met him through a friend who had known Hall a year or so ago when he had come to Miami. Hall had informed the friend that he was able, had munitions and knowledge and a will to fight, and wanted to join with some Cubans in Miami. Hall, Howard, and Seymour arrived in Miami on either September 29th or 30th of 63, and were introduced to Aguilar by the friend who has since died in Cuba. Aguilar would not name the friend. Aguilar claims to have owned a boat worth approximately $5,000. It was named the Pituza Primera. He believes that the registration number was FL2906. Highway Patrol picked up the whole bunch at a motel in the Keys, and they found arms in the second car. The Highway Patrol, which is the Monroe County Patrol, arrested Hall, newspaper man with the guns, and a Cuban who was keeping the guns. Neither Seymour nor Howard were detained, and the others were not formally arrested but turned loose after a few minutes. All that happened was that the Highway Patrol confiscated Aguilar's boat. The two cars were immediately returned, and in due time, Aguilar was told that he could recover his boat if he would pay a $600 storage fee. As he did not have the $600, he left it with the CIA, which then kept it for its own use. 2 or 3 weeks later, Hall left Miami, and it was the last time that Aguilar saw him. Aguilar feels that Patrick was an informer for the CIA, or the FBI. He was very bitter about this, as he thinks that Patrick informed on this particular operation. As a result of this, he lost his boat, and the Hall-Howard-Seymour plan went totally awry. Aguilar remarked that this trio was from the West Coast and had no money at all. He believes that Hall's wife sent him money for an airline ticket. However, Howard and Seymour, who had a falling out with Hall, went back by driving a Cadillac back to California, which they had gotten from an agency in Miami that wished to ship it to the West Coast. Aguilar feels that Hall is a very low type, that he was very fond of Howard. Subsequent to Howard's return to the West Coast, he had a long correspondence with him, and at one time Howard sent him $25 when he very badly needed money. The last time that he heard from Howard was 5 months before his arrest in California. Howard said that the FBI was giving him a very bad time because of his part in the assassination. Howard said that Hall had told the FBI that Howard was involved. Ever since they left Miami, Hall and Howard had been at odds. As late as 1968, Howard has telephoned Aguilar and told him that he has been cleared by the FBI and that he will return to Miami soon, and that he will bring an FBI agent along to explain his innocence. And then it just goes on into a couple of other subjects about Luis Balbuena. Aguilar confirmed the fact that Balbuena did attempt to kill Raul Castro in 1959. Aguilar says that he personally knows of 3 attempts on the life of Fidel Castro by naval intelligence. These attempts were made before Aguilar left in 1961. He says that since then he believes there have been a number of attempts, but he has no personal knowledge of them. Aguilar says that he went to Washington shortly after the Bay of Pigs and talked to the FBI, including a conversation with J. Edgar Hoover himself. Hoover said the FBI could not help the Cubans, that they could depend only on the CIA. As to the assassination in Dallas, Aguilar says that he did not think that any Cubans were involved. However, if any were involved, he believed that they were communist or pro-Castro. Aguilar appears to be a very honest and forthright person, and he has a great deal of factual information which could be gotten from him. So, interesting to hear Manny Aguilar's side of things when it comes to these Hall, Howard, and Seymour guys and what they were trying to do down there in Florida. Now, as I mentioned in a previous show, I had finally came back upon the nodules of A.J. Weberman. Well, I also found this. His nodules only had part of the interview from when A.J. Weberman called Lauren Hall on April 22nd, 1977. Now, A.J. Weberman turned over tapes of this conversation to the HSCA, and it was re-recorded and transcribed, I guess, by the HSCA investigator Cliff Fenton. And I've got the entire interview from start to finish. And while there is a lot of juicy parts in here, we will hit the highlights. Mr. Hall? Yeah? This is A.J. Weberman calling from the National Enquirer. Pardon? A.J. Weberman, I'm calling from the National Enquirer. This is... Really? Is this Lauren Hall? Yeah, I'm not the National Enquirer. Oh, I know you're not. I'm calling for the National Enquirer. Hall says, oh, okay. Weberman says, I spoke with Gerald Patrick Hemming the other day, and he told me about a meeting that allegedly took place in New Orleans between himself and George de Mohrenschildt. I wonder if you could confirm or deny that meeting. What meeting is that? Weberman says, well, I don't know. He said he met with George de Mohrenschildt shortly before the Kennedy assassination. Hall says, who is Jerry Patrick Hemming? Weberman says, do I have the Lauren Eugene Hall? Hall says, yeah. Weberman asked him, you were called before the Warren Commission, right? You were mentioned in the Warren report. Yeah. And you don't know Jerry Patrick Hemming? Never heard of him. Who is he? Some left-winger? No. He's with the International Anti-Communist Brigade. Hall says, well, that's a communist organization. And Weberman says, the Anti-Communist Brigade? Hall says, yeah, I wouldn't know anybody like that. Anybody with the name of Jerry Patrick Hemming has got to be communist or CIA. Well, Weberman says, I think this man is pretty dedicated anti-communist. Who? Jerry Patrick Hemming? Yeah. Well, if it's the one I heard about, he's CIA. Weberman says, well, see, I have a document here that says you and Mr. Hemming took a rifle out of pawn that was described as being identical to the one used by Lee Harvey Oswald. Hall says, well, I'll be darned. Who's Lee Harvey Oswald? Weberman says, who's Lee Harvey Oswald? Hall says, yeah. Weberman says, I take it you don't want to talk. Hall says, no, I've got nothing to talk to you about. Anybody who associates with Jerry Patrick Hemming. No, I didn't say that. Hall says, it has either got to be CIA, FBI, or an asshole. Now, we've heard all that stuff. And Weberman says, and you know the National Enquirer is also interested in speaking with you. Hall says, fuck the National Enquirer. Well, you know, they pay a lot of money. Hall says, huh? Weberman says, they pay a lot of money. Hall says, hey, dude, shit. All I've heard for 14 fucking years is how much money everybody's got. Weberman says, right. Hall says, and I ain't ever seen any of it. And all I hear in print is from de Mohrenschildt and the asshole Altmans and Jerry Patrick Hemming and Mort Saul and all the fuck-ups of the world. He says, Weberman says, well, I've got a book out too. I've got a book out on the John Kennedy assassination. And Hall says, screw all of them. Ain't nobody going to put nothing in print from me. I've had a book printed, and the FBI, the CIA, and the IRS has got it stopped 3 different times. It cost me $48,000 in taxes. Don't even talk to me about none of that horse shit. Webman says, well, I had a book that was suppressed too called Coup d'etat in America. It's on the assassination of John Kennedy, and I had pictures of the tramps they picked up in Dealey Plaza. Hall says, oh, what tramps? Tramps, the tramps. Hall says, what tramps? The ones that look like Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis. Hall says, shit, Kennedy was a tramp. Lauren? Female voice? Yeah. Hall says, that book was not for press. We saw it. Webman says, what, coup d'etat? So it sounds like they're having a... So then Hall says, you bet, it's in the library right here in Long Beach. Webman says, well, that's good, but you know... And then Hall says, well, you just lied. Webman says, no, I didn't just lie. It was suppressed. You didn't see any national reviews on it, did you? It wasn't in the New York Times book review. Hall said, well, but it's in print. It's in hardback at the library. Yeah, news of it was suppressed, and then my publisher went bankrupt. Well, so did my publisher, Turkey. Yeah, well, your book was... Well, he caught up with his ass 2 weeks ago. Well, it's amazing that news of your books was stopped by... Hall says, hey, nobody puts in print anything I have to say, okay? Nobody. Nobody's going to pay me for it. Nobody's going to print anything, and that's fine. You know, hey, I ain't in no hurry to get my head blown off. Webman says, I see they got Hemming on these. And then he says, well, Hemming's a CIA punk. I've known the son of a bitch for 14 years. He turned his own goddamn cruise in so I wouldn't have to go to Cuba. He's fingered me on my own goddamn deals and calls me to get arrested. And then there's a female voice that says, Lauren, don't tell them nothing. Hall says, ah, fuck. The female voice says, don't bother to call here anymore. Webman says, I won't. This is the first time I called here, though, you know. The female says, well, after the hatchet job that's already been done on him in other papers, that's it. Webman says, yeah, but did I do a hatch-up job on him in coup d'etat? Hall says, what? Did I do a hatchet job on you in coup d'etat? The female said, well, the thing is, we don't need to see his name in print anywhere. Hall said, hey, man, right as it stands right now, there's only 2 of us left alive. That's me and Santiago Trafficante. And as far as I'm concerned, we're both going to stay alive because I ain't going to say shit. Webman says, all right, well, I don't want to endanger you. Hall says, I ain't going to let no asshole come and blow me away. Webman says, right, all right, I understand that, but you know, you're probably on that witness list to be called. Hall said, no, I'm on no goddamn witness list to be called shit place. Nobody's going to listen to anything I say because nobody wants to hear it. Webman says, no, they want to hear it. From my sources on the committee, you're on the witness list, you're scheduled to be called, and that's the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Hall says, well, there are a bunch of left-wing assholes that are trying to get a feather in their cap and be able to live for the next 2 years off the taxpayers. And they're not going to do a damn thing, just like the church committee, just like Garrison. Hey, the whole ramrod is all bullshit. They're going to ask me if I've ever been in Florida, and I'm going to say yes. And they're going to say, did you enjoy it? And I'm going to say yes. And then they say, all right, go home. That's what it's going to amount to. Webman said, well, there's some really crazy things going on here, like Carlos Prio's suicide, DeMorshill's suicide, William Pauley's suicide. Hall says, who are they? Webman says, these are... Hall says, I know who they are. Pauley was the ambassador to Peru. We used his boat on a raid to try to put a hit on Castro. The female voice says, Lauren, don't tell him. Webman says, so Hemming's been indicted yesterday for possession of a silencer. And Hall says again, Hemming is CIA. Novell has been indicted for firebombing. Hall says, who? There was an assassination attempt against Louis Rebel, and he was in the hospital a couple weeks ago for self-inflicted gunshot wounds. Hall said, who gives a shit? Webman says, I'm saying if you should. And Hall says, the only thing I'm saying is if any of you assholes come near me, you better have a fucking army with you, baby, because I've got my shit together, and I'll blow the first one of you motherfuckers away that even comes near me. And that you can put in print. Boom. So, that was the entire Weberman Hall conversation. It's definitely a good one. Definitely a good one. And then I also stumbled upon a HSCA document, I guess a pre-interview interview of Lauren Hall, dated August 26, 1977. And they had actually went to Wichita and were in the attorney's office, Hall's attorney, Bryson Mills, and talked to Hall for 3 days. So there's a lot of goodies in here. So they go all the way back to the time of, when Hall was in a Quonset hut with 3 other people, including Santos Trafficante and his son-in-law, Jerry, and an Italian car dealer. Prior to that, Hall had been staying at the St. John Hotel, and Frank Sturgis had an apartment just west of there. He only spent about a week in the Quonset hut with Santo Trafficante. They never talked about anything serious, so he says. Then he says Camilo Cienfuegos came out and took Hall to the airport and shipped him back to the States. Hall recalled that Santo had mentioned to his son-in-law that there were warrants out on him for the Appalachian meeting, and he needed an attorney there to meet him. In December of 1962, Hall read in the paper that Hemming had been training troops, had been arrested, and was returning to his home in Alhambra, California. Hall claims to have met Hemming briefly in Cuba. Hall contacted Hemming. From 1959 to 1963, it was a real low-key affair for me. The second day after Hall got back to the States, a CIA dude from Kansas City came and debriefed him. He advised that Hall was lucky to be out of Cuba and he should take a real low-key position since he was an officer in the Cuban Army and could be deported back to Cuba. A week or two later, Hall got a call from Morris Corcoran, a Wichita Crime Commission chief, advising that a man from the IRS wanted to see him. Hall signed a statement that he had never been in the Cuban Armed Force and had never taken an oath of allegiance, and that Fidel was not a communist. He did so to avoid being deported to Cuba. Hall then had a restaurant in Wichita and later moved to California. In January of 1963, Hall and Hemming decided to return to Florida. They went around to see people like Terso Del Junco, Jose Norman, a guy named Lyons, and a bunch of people in a conservative movement, John Rousselot, Dick Hathcock. Jerry hawked a 30-06 with a Bushnell 30-power scope. Hemming was a friend of Hathcock, and Hall hawked a set of golf clubs. Then they went to Miami in Hall's Oldsmobile. Hall and Hemming went through Dallas. They went to the home of one of Hemming's friends named Boats. He had an employment office in Dallas. He had been a chief petty officer in the Navy. Boats brought over a Dallas newspaper man who did an article on Hall and Hemming. Then he called Robert Morris, a conservative attorney and associate of General Edwin Walker, who gave Hemming some names, including that of Lester Logue and a man named Patterson. They wanted to help groups going into Cuba. Offices of Patterson were in the Love Building in Dallas. Lester Logue gave Hemming money to replace a water pump on their car. They went over to a Dallas Ford dealer. A salesman there took them over to see General Walker, where Hemming described his plan to form a mercenary army which would be anti-communist and available where needed. Walker gave them verbal encouragement, but nothing more due to ill health. After talking to a few more people, while staying at Boats' house for 3 or 4 days, they left for New Orleans. They arrived in New Orleans at 9 or 9:30 p.m., went to a laundromat owned by a Cuban who was in charge of the railroad system under Batista, later identified as Frank Barthez. Then they went to the home of Larry Laborde. His son answered and advised that his father was in South America someplace. Hall knew he was CIA. They left and went through Jacksonville. Hall tried to call Santo Trafficante. The phone was answered by someone who identified himself as Santo's brother, who said Santo was not available. They went on to Miami, where they stayed in a one-bedroom apartment with which was 8 or 9 blocks from Mom's, where a group of people were laying around drinking beer. They included Larry Howard, Bill Seymour, Patterson, Ponce de Leon, Howard Davis. Davis seemed to be like Jerry's boss. Hemming and Davis held frequent secretive conferences. Hemming appeared to be reporting back to Davis, and Hall has a feeling now that Davis was Hemming's CIA agent in charge. Well, we do know that Howard K. Davis was definitely an FBI informant. So there you go. Oh yeah, this is a little interesting tidbit. Enrique Molina introduced Hall to Eddie Bayo, Luis Castillo, Cantino, and the rest of Bayo's group. Hall met Bayo in Cuba. Molina found an abandoned boat in the Caribbean and brought it back to Miami. They scrounged some equipment and went in on a raid on the end of February or 1st of March. They begged, borrowed, and stole equipment, even attempted to steal from the CIA front American rock and minerals in Key West. They even tried to steal the PT boat from the film PT-109. The boat was dry docked, but they stole several thousand rounds from the filmmakers, only to discover that they were just blanks. Can you imagine that? Oh my God. After they got into Miami, Hall took off for Dallas to try to get some help from Lester Logue. His wound, sustained from a raid, was treated by a Cuban. A woman in Dallas named Schultz, who worked for boats, redressed his wound in Dallas. He arrived in Dallas sometimes during the first couple weeks of March '63. Hall had to wait a couple more days to see Lester Logue since he was out of town. Hall stayed at Schultz's house, and on a trip to the lake, his legs started to bleed again, so she changed the bandage. So Logue returned and stated that what he wanted to do was find some former member of the Cuban government to head a government in exile. And Logue felt that he could get enough people together with big money. The plan was to land a couple thousand people in Cuba with a recognized president in exile, and then appeal to the UN and the OAS for assistance and help and recognition. Logue had contacts in Guatemala and Nicaragua who would recognize him immediately. Logue gave Hall enough money to drive back to Florida. So then it goes on and on about the meeting with John Martino, about Martino taking Hall, Bayo, and Castillo to a hotel, speaking to Santo Trafficante, trying to get a boat. Rip Robertson was at Martino's house. Robertson had a letter which indicated this was Operation Cobra, which was a part of Mongoose, and it was signed by Bissell, a high-level CIA at the time. So, and it just goes on and on for many, many, many pages. I mean, I can't even, we'd be here for hours talking about all this stuff. Most of it we know already. You know, we know about the Logue stuff, the $50,000 offer. It just goes into a lot more detail. A lot more detail. So yeah, it's very interesting for sure. I'm just skimming through to see if there's anything else that we should maybe discuss here. It tells about how they got into Dallas and that Hall was arrested on drug charges, interviewed by the FBI, military intelligence, and CIA. There's 3 pages of handwritten stuff that I cannot read because it's in cursive. Hall talks about him and Howard going to meet Logue and getting the trailer of guns out of his house. While in Dallas on that trip, Hall went to see boats, Nico Crespi, as well, to see if he wanted to join them on a raid. About half a day outside of Miami, Howard told Hall that he might be having a problem with Celio Alba. Hall told him that was his problem. He doesn't recall any stops between Dallas and Miami. Pulling into Miami, Howard told Hall, "I'm afraid this guy, Alba, is going to fink on us." Hall told him he didn't want any part of it. "Just blow his goddamn head off if you have to." Oh, God. Yeah. So then going back, they were talking about his arrest in Dallas. Lowe got an attorney who came and placed a bond for Seymour and got him out, but couldn't get Hall out. According to the DA, Wade was going to throw the book at Hall. The only reason given was that the car was Hall's and he was driving. He was told to go into a room to talk to a CIA man. Hall says, "I opened the door and I told him to hang it in his ass." Then he was told somebody else wanted to talk to him. He was taken into another room to see a sergeant from military intelligence dressed in civilian clothes. Hall thinks he was from Fort Hood. He knew what I was there for. He knew all about Hall's raids into Cuba, his association with Castro, and the fact that he had equipment someplace. He asked Hall what he had seen in Cuba, and Hall related the story about the rolls of film. They talked for about 30 minutes, and he asked Hall if he would consider going to work for military intelligence. Hall said sure, and was told they would contact him later. Hall describes him as 26 or 27 years old. He did see his credentials. As he walked out, Hall was told there was one more person who wanted to see him. He walked into an office, and the man presented his FBI credentials and told Hall his name was Hosty, an older man. He told Hall that the pills had come from Mexico. They talked about the raids into Cuba, and Hall told him that he was in Dallas on vacation and trying to round up support. He told Hall that the federal government had no charges against him. They were talking about Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs, and I said, well, what somebody ought to do is blow his goddamn head off. It didn't disturb the FBI man at all. Then he was returned to his cell. The jailer came and got him and told him he was bailed out and gave him his attorney's address to go to. The attorney was a young dude. Logan hired him and put up the bond money. The attorney told him, "I don't know what the hell you've done to the state of Texas and the city of Dallas, and especially Wade, but he is pissed, and he is not going to drop the charges." Hall was told he could get up to 10 years. He was told to go register at the YMCA, that Seymour and Howard were already there, and Logue would contact him there. When Hall went to see Garrison in '68, he was shown a registration page which included Hall's name, Howard's name, and Lee Harvey Oswald's name, but not Seymour's. Hall recalls writing in the date when he registered. Hall was never at the YMCA with Howard, he says. After that, Hall got together with Seymour, Logue came down, and they had lunch together. I mean, it's just a big cluster. Talking about staying in an apartment in Dallas in October. Talking about 10,000 rounds of 30-06 ammo, a 20mm cannon, paying $250 to get a boat out of dry dock, gas for it. Howard met them and told them he could get Manny Aguilar's boat. The next day we went and looked at the boat. It was exactly what we needed. It was everything they said it was. A 36-foot beauty. It had no name on it. It was a real dark color. Hall later discovered that Hemming had an apartment right across the canal from the boat. So anyway, yeah, this is when they were getting ready to go on the raid, and they had Manny Aguilar's boat, and they were stopped by the cops because he thinks that Hemming told on him. Advised by the person taking him into custody that they had been watching the boat from the apartment of one of their friends, implying Hemming. Officer said, "If you have any 6'5" friends, you'd better be careful." Hall was released from the Coast Guard office at 5 a.m. with no charges. Tom Duncan was waiting and went back in and took pictures of the confiscated equipment that was laid out there. They went over to Aguilar's house. They still had enough equipment stashed at Crockett's house for another run. Howard and Seymour came over that night and asked for equipment to make another run. Hall told them he couldn't turn it over to them, and they were pissed off. That same night, Hemming called at Aguilar's and told Hall that he had stolen the rifle from Hathcock. Hall says, "You're full of shit. I paid $50 for it." Hemming says, "It's mine. I want it back. I'll kick your ass." He never did. Hall discovered 3 or 4 weeks ago that the same day Hemming filed charges of theft against him in Miami, claiming that Hall and Perez had stolen 3 rifles from Hemming's apartment. Hall thinks that by Perez, Hemming actually meant Bayou, and Bayou was already dead. Hemming also reported that Hall had stolen a .30-06 from him. Hall, Howard, and Seymour bunked in together. Every time they approached a Cuban to use his boat, the boat would get confiscated. As a last resort, Hall went to see Frank Sturgis. Hall was advised that he was now bad news, the word was out, and nobody would help him. So Hall went to Dr. Crockett's and borrowed $50. He sold one of the rifles to Manny's cousin for $75. With that money, Hall flew back to California, and Crockett forwarded the equipment by Railway Express. The Johnson .30-06 would not fit, so Hall told Crockett to keep it for a while, and Hall would take care of it. On the day that Hall left Miami, he was driving to the airport in Aguilar's Buick with Aguilar and his cousin. A motorcycle cop stopped him for failure to yield right away and gave him a ticket and took his driver's license. This was around the 7th, 8th, or 9th of November. Seymour and Howard left Miami in a U-Drive car, which is kind of like a U-Haul. Seymour dropped in Arizona and Howard drove on to L.A. Sometime after the assassination, Hall's equipment arrived at the Railway Express in Pasadena, but the .30-06 was not with it. Sometime later, Hemming phoned Hall to tell him that he got his rifle back. Shortly after arrival in L.A., on November 9th or 10th, Hall and his wife attended a UROC meeting. At that meeting, Bob Hudson offered him a job at IPCO Hospital Supply. Hall was looking for work, and he went around Hathcock's office several times. He didn't work at all during this period. The job at IPCO didn't pay shit. According to Hall, on the day of the assassination, he had taken his wife to work, came back home, took a shower, and was shaving when the announcement came on TV. After all the shit that he'd been coming down in Dallas with me, I thought I'd better get my ass clean and make damn sure people knew where I was at. So I called my wife. I then called Mildred Hyatt at her house in Whittier. He had her call him back to verify he was at the house. He went down to see Bob Hudson at IPCO Hospital Supply. Hudson introduced him around, and they went to the restaurant on the corner and spent 2 or 3 hours at lunch. Hall then went over to pick up his wife at California Milling. He doesn't recall leaving L.A. area between return from Miami and day of the assassination. Other than the meeting at Logue's office, he says he was never specifically offered money to do away with Kennedy. Especially at the Miami meeting, there was never a mention of anybody but Castro. At several meetings, there was speculation that a hit on Kennedy would be worth $1 million. Mildred had subsequently told Hall that she was at her sister-in-law's house on that entire day and could not have possibly talked to him. Hall now understands that his wife does not recall anything about the day of the assassination. It is Hall's understanding that Bob Hudson will not talk to anybody now because he really doesn't remember anything about Hall going to his office. He did testify in Hall's favor at Garrison's extradition hearing, though. In 76 or 77, Hall's sister heard a caller to a San Francisco radio talk show state that she could prove that he was in L.A. on the date of the assassination. Hall thinks the caller was a young blonde woman who worked at IPCO. Hall has been back to Dallas once. In 1975, he was on vacation and went there to see his wife's son, Cliff, who lives in Richardson. They spent 2 or 3 days there. The hotel he stayed out in with Howard and Alba, it had multicolored marquee in front, multicolored like a red-colored circle or a square on top, and like next one down was green, and the next one was like blue. We were close to a park. The park would have been to the west. The motel was a one-story deal. It had a swimming pool way out in front, and off to the northeast was a takeout hamburger stand. The stand had a room in back where you could sit down. Prior to 63, Hall had been in New York twice. In 63, he stayed possibly in Flatbush or Manhattan, saw bars named Flatbush and Duffy's Tavern. Must have been watching The Simpsons. Yeah. So, he says this too. While staying at the Biscayne Hotel in New Orleans in 68, when he was interviewed by Garrison, he was approached at poolside by the daughter of Carlos Marcello and photographed with her. Hall immediately thought he was being set up. On the same trip in a bar, Hall was approached while out with drinks with one of Garrison's investigators named Bordelon. In one Cuban bar, the owner walked up and said, "Welcome back, Lorenzo." Hall told him that he had never been there before. Again, he felt like he was being set up. In 68, Larry Schiller and Jerry Cohen from the LA Times initially dissuaded Hall from voluntarily going and talking with Garrison. It was as if they were sent there for the specific purpose of keeping me from making anything public about what all had transpired. In 1975, in response to a Washington Post article regarding the Pauley raid, Hall went to see Cohen and told him about Rosselli, Giancana, and Trafficante. Cohen told him nobody was interested. It wasn't even newsworthy. Shortly thereafter, Hall learned that Rosselli and Giancana had been killed. Someone asked Hall to fill out a resume for the DOJ in California. In it, he included information from Rolando Masfer. Then, miraculously, Rolando Masfer's car blows up. Everybody I've been involved with seems to have living problems. He met a Eugene Bradley at Clint Wheat's house. He tried to get Hall involved in a Jewish thing. He got mad when Hall wouldn't go along with him. The name Jim Braden means nothing to him. He never met anyone named Duvalier. He did know a Louis Castillo, however, he did not have any information on him. One of the visitors, on 7 or 8 occasions, Judith Exner Campbell, came to the prison in Cuba to see Ruben Miro. Once or twice, she was there with a woman Hall later learned was the woman Frank Farini was using to slip a pill to zap Castro with. On one Sunday, Hall, Miro, and the two women went to the officers' club and had malts, and then went to the movies. They saw Cantinflas and a propaganda film which was funnier than Cantinflas. Exner was trying to set it up so that Miro would be sent to the United States rather than Panama or Nicaragua. Some people in Chicago were trying to help him get to the States. The bullshit rumor was that Ruben was falsely accused of being the assassinator of President Somoza of Nicaragua. He formed a Panamanian expedition into Cuba. They took off without him and landed at Nombres de Dios in Panama. Fidel got pissed, so they arrested Ruben. Hall heard a story after he left Cuba regarding Fidel's jealousy of Camilo Cienfuegos' superior popularity in Cuba. An American nurse went to the palace with Camilo. She waited in the car with Osmani. They heard a couple shots. Che Guevara, Raul, and Fidel came down. Fidel was enraged, screaming, "I killed the son of a bitch. I finally did it." Once he was cautioned in Los Angeles regarding a Cuban who was possibly a Fidel agent. Once Hemming alleged that Enrique Molina was a Fidel agent. Hall didn't believe it. So there's quite a bit to unpack from all of that. Good stuff. Manny Aguilar, Lauren Hall, and his many, many accusations, if you will. Oh boy. Alright, let's hear now from the mother of the accused assassin, Marguerite Osvaldovich. Marge, bring us in, babe.
When I was sitting down watching the television, I heard my son as leaving from one room from the other, what the police officers say, "I didn't do it, I didn't do it." So I heard him say, "I didn't do it." And I was asked the question when I was allowed to see him in jail afterward, Did I ask my son if he did it? Well, I have definite feelings about that. I would not insult my son and ask him if he did it, because I heard him in his own voice say many a time on the television, I did not do it, I did not do it. So I am assuming that he is innocent until proven guilty. That is our American way of life.
You said something to the effect the FBI should have kept a watch on your son while the president was visiting Dallas. Were you imputing any guilt on his part by that statement?
No. I say, the day before, I think, I watched on television and read in the paper where, of course, all of agents were in Dallas preparing the visit of President Kennedy's security. And so I will say, since my son had defected to Russia, he should have been under surveillance. And had he been under surveillance for the president's journey to Dallas, then President Kennedy would be alive today, and so would my son. And that is security protection. He is a known, I hate to use the word, but I will use it, character. And all known characters were being screened and would be under surveillance while President Kennedy was making his tour of Dallas. So then why wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald, a known defector, not under surveillance? He always seemed to know things. Just, for instance, any quiz programs on television, he could immediately give you the answers. Any things of any significance that another child would not be interested in, he was interested in, and could, well, what I'm trying to say, if somebody was going to fly from one place to the other, he could almost give you the mileage and things of that sort. He just seemed to know all of these things. And they appeal to him, history and everything of we consider in our society of the finest reading there is. And he read things far beyond his years, but understood them. And yet, I say, he played, as when we own our home, he played with the children in the neighborhood and played football at school and ran around, but then he always had time to him in these important things that he wanted to know about. But the main thing was the quiz programs and things that he knew these answers used to amaze me, how he knew the correct answers.
Do you recall any examples of advanced reading or materials? What materials was he reading?
Well, he liked to read Vincent Peale. It's awfully hard for me to remember. Hemingway. Lee, I will go in that category, but I will put it this way. We never, the boys, myself and Lee, never read detective stories or pocket, not that they're not the things to read, I'm not implying that, but Lee never read trashy things. Well, I don't know how else to say it.
Had Lee, in his readings of history, ever expressed to you the feeling that he had a special role in life?
No. Now, there again, and it may seem odd, Lee did not discuss any of this, his feelings about, because I'm his mother. I'm a working mother. You see, things are different under different environment and circumstances. I am not a mother that the children come home to that has the money and the mothers come home. When these children come home, I am working. I have the support of these children. So I'm not the type of mother that has the time, the daytime, to be with the children. When these boys come home at 3 o'clock from school, their mother's not at home. So when I come home from work, approximately 6 or 6:30, I have to cook and feed the children. And so there's very little time for conversation. Not that we were in a happy family. We watched television and had our little things, but no intimate discussion, like you asked me, that Lee would talk to me about the history and things. I was too busy a mother supporting my children.
So that was interesting to hear from Lee Harvey Oswald's mother about how voracious a reader he was, very intelligent, read beyond his years. but also the struggles that she had as a single mother, a working mother, and dealing with these 3 boys, often stating that she wasn't at home, and they would come home from school and things, and by the time she did get home, it was dinner time for bath, schoolwork, not a lot of time to sit down and conversate. Yet each of these 3 boys, John, Pike, Robert, and Lee, could not wait to get the hell out of this woman's care and join the armed forces. Seemed to be their ticket, their one-way ticket out. I did a show a couple weeks ago called Agent Oswald, where we looked at different aspects of reasons why Oswald could have possibly been an agent of the CIA or, an FBI informant, what have you. And one of the things that we mentioned was that, Mrs. Marguerite Oswald always believed that her son was doing some kind of undercover work for the government while he went to Russia. And in this FBI document from January 3rd, 1964, states, Mrs. Ruth Payne advised that she had just talked with a reporter from the Houston Post newspaper and that this individual was returning to her home later in the day. Mrs. Payne stated that the reporter had advised her that Lee Harvey Oswald's mother had been working for a party in Fort Worth during September and October of '62 as a practical nurse. And according to this newspaper reporter, Mrs. Oswald, the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, advised the woman during her employment that her son was doing important anti-subversive work for the government. And then to give you a little more detail about this, I guess the reporter's name was Lonnie Hudkins, and returned to see her the afternoon of December 28th. Mrs. Payne furnished the following information concerning this contact by Hudkins. Hudkins referred to an article which he stated had appeared in the New York Times, either the 26th or 27th of '63, which article conjectured that Lee Harvey Oswald probably made a deal with the U.S. government to work on its behalf in anti-subversive endeavors in return for being granted permission to return to the United States. She stated that the article reportedly goes on to bring out that Oswald probably was not being watched any more closely than he was by the FBI because Oswald was working for or on behalf of our government. Mrs. Payne stated that Hudkins said that a socially prominent person for whom Oswald's mother had worked for in Fort Worth about a year ago was supposed to have been told at that time by Oswald's mother that Oswald was doing important anti-subversive work for the government. Mrs. Payne stated that Hudkins' primary purpose of seeing her was in an effort to get some information, if possible, of the possibility Oswald was actually working on behalf of the U.S. government prior to the assassination. Mrs. Payne told Hudkins that she knew of no such situation and ventured the opinion to Hudkins that the story was highly unlikely since she could not imagine anyone having that much confidence in Oswald. Well, it's clear that Ruth Payne doesn't think much of Oswald, but boy does his mama. More on Hudkins. Under date of December 31st, '63, the Houston office advised that Lonnie Hudkins had advised Special Agent James Isell that in his conversations with Ruth Payne, the socially prominent Fort Worth woman referred to was named Linda Rosenthal, who lives in the 4800 block of Orem Street, Fort Worth, Texas. Hudkins advised that Mrs. Rosenthal had employed Mrs. Oswald in September and October of '62, and that Rosenthal had previously been interviewed by the FBI already. Hudkins concluded by stating he was on a fishing expedition and was attempting to determine if Oswald had been a stool pigeon for some government agency such as the CIA or the FBI. It's an interesting theory. to think that, okay, Oswald, you really want to come back to the United States from Russia? Well, we'll pay to bring you back, but you're going to have to do some work for us. You're going to be our little bitch. And this is something Lonnie Huckins was trying to convey. It should be noted that Linda Rosenthal was interviewed on November the 29th, 1963, the results of which interview had previously been reported. In this interview, Mrs. Rosenthal stated that from conversations with Marguerite Oswald, she got the impression that Mrs. Oswald, that her son, who was in Russia, was working for the U.S. government in Russia. She could not recall any definite statements that Mrs. Oswald made about the nature of the work of her son in Russia. So, Marguerite was telling people this for sure. For sure. On January 10th of 64, Mrs. Ruth Payne advised that Lonnie Huckins of the Houston Post newspaper, in his contact with her on Saturday, December 28th, had stated that the FBI was foolish to deny that Agent James Hosty had tried to develop Lee Harvey Oswald as an informant. Mrs. Payne stated she made no comment one way or the other to Huckins regarding this remark. Mrs. Payne stated that she knew that Hosty had not interviewed Lee Harvey Oswald. And this report is from Bardem and Hosty, January 6th. Boy, Ruth is just running to the FBI and just telling them everything. Telling them everything. So, what exactly did Lee Harvey Oswald tell his mother after he was arrested? So Oswald's mother actually wrote a piece for the Pacific News Service called "A Tree Grows in Dallas" by Marguerite Oswald. And this was for the 15th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. So, she writes this. Lee Harvey Oswald was picked up by the Dallas police on November 22nd, 1963, as a suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy. For 2 long days and nights, he proclaimed his innocence, always denying he had nothing to do with the killing of President Kennedy or Patrolman J.D. Tippit. We know his face was badly bruised. The pictures show it. He had black eyes and scratches on his face when I visited him in jail on November 23rd, 1963. He told me, "Don't worry, Mother. I will get an attorney. I know my rights. Please do not interfere." That was the last time I saw my son, because on the morning of November 24th, 1963, he was shot by Jack Ruby while handcuffed in police custody before millions of people who viewed the tragic event on television. He had just turned 24 on October the 18th, 1963. I hope that I will be able to bring something into the lives of those who read this story, and in some manner bring about a better understanding of the Oswald family, victims of circumstances over which we had no control. I have tried to portray our feelings when our beloved son, brother, husband, and father was murdered and buried in one of the most heart-rending funeral services, for me at least, that has ever been conducted. On the morning of November 25th, the day of the funeral, the family was lodged at the inn of the Six Flags at Arlington, Texas, between Dallas and Fort Worth. We were under protective custody of the United States Secret Service, my daughter-in-law Marina, my son Robert, myself, and Lee's 2 adorable little girls, June, Lee, and Rachel, were together. I was told 1 hour in advance to make ready that Lee's funeral was about to take place. The Secret Service agents did not ask me if I needed anything, but wanted to know Marina's size because they wanted to buy her a dress. They went into nearby Arlington and selected 2 black dresses so that Marina would have a choice. They brought Lee and Marina's firstborn June, aged 21 months, a new outfit and some white high-top shoes. I helped dress baby Rachel, who was only 1 month and 2 days old. The baby had no new clothes, nor did I, but this was all right with me, for Marina and June Lee did. We left to go to Lee's funeral, where services were to be held at 4 p.m. at Rose Hill Burial Park. His wife Marina, his 2 babies, his brother Robert, and myself, the only ones there to cry for him. His older half-brother, John Pike, was not present because he was a career man with the United States Air Force in uniform at the time, and the government decided it best that he not attend. Earlier, after Robert had contacted 3 ministers who would not help us in our sorrow, or take the boy's body into a church, or even participate on the grounds, one minister, after much persuasion, finally consented that we would have chapel services. He refused to bring the body into the church, however, but finally consented that we would have chapel services graveside. So much for Christianity as we knew it today. The laws of our land state that clearly a person is considered innocent until tried by a jury and found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. There was a beautiful chapel on the grounds of Rose Hill Burial Park on the outskirts of Fort Worth. Our family did think the minister would keep his word, but when we entered the chapel, it was empty. My son Robert cried bitterly because his brother's body was not there. Lee's body had been brought to the chapel and remained there for almost an hour, but someone ordered the body removed to the gravesite. As we got to the grave, Mr. Paul Grudy, who was the funeral director from Miller's Funeral Home, came forward and said, "Mrs. Oswald, I'm sorry, but we don't have a minister." Then Reverend Louis Sanders, who is an executive for the Fort Worth Area Council of Churches, stepped forward and said, "Mrs. Oswald, if you like, I will help out." The Reverend Saunders had not preached a sermon in 8 years. He had come to the cemetery on his own, he told me. He had no time to prepare a sermon, and he left his Bible in the car and parked 2 blocks away. So, off the top of his head, Reverend Saunders began, "We have come here today to lay away the body of Lee Harvey Oswald. We are not here to judge him, but to bury him. May God have mercy on his soul." Then he turned to newsmen and security men and said, "His mother has informed me that Lee was a good son to her, a good husband to his wife, and a good father to his children. We insisted upon remaining until the coffin was lowered into the grave." Then Marina went over and picked up a handful of dirt, making the sign of the cross. I was surprised, but I assume this is also the custom in Russia. I followed suit, and so did Robert. As we left the grounds, I noticed a sight I had seen as we came in, and one I shall never forget. The cemetery flag was at half-staff. Of course I knew it was flying low because our president had died, but to me it also meant that my son was being buried under a flag that was half-staff too. Sometimes there is joy even in sorrow. The 3 men who died in Dallas were all buried on the same day. First President Kennedy, then Patrolman Tippit, and then my son. The pain and sorrow of Lee's burial followed me for many months. It was climaxed in May of '64 when I was watching a television program about President Kennedy's grave. As I watched, the scene shifted to my son's grave, and I bent forward with renewed interest, but the announcer's next word cut to the bottom of my heart. "The assassin's grave has on it a dead tree," and a picture was shown of a tree. The leaves had fallen off, and it certainly looked dead. Not one time in the past 6 months had my composure broken, but this time, alone in my house, I broke down and wept uncontrollably. To hear my son referred to as an assassin, without the qualified alleged, was more than I can take. He was only the accused, had never stood before a jury, never been tried or convicted. And then there was the picture of the dead tree. I knew nothing about the tree, which was a weeping willow. I soon learned it had been planted a few days earlier, since my last visit to the cemetery. I did not know who put it there, but it had not been watered and appeared to have died immediately. I had taken a personal interest in keeping Lee's grave neat-looking, for many people passed by to take pictures for history. I was determined that by the next Sunday my son's grave would be the nicest looking in the particular section of Rose Hill Burial Park. I drove all over Fort Worth and went to Arlington, and finally back to Fort Worth before I found what I was looking for. I was seeking sodded grass, the kind that comes in rolls, already grown. Finally, I found a greenhouse that had the grass. The greenhouse owner brought out a roll of fresh cut sod, and I made ready to pay him, and he said, No, Miss Oswald, I'm a sympathizer, and I would not accept payment from you. It won't cost you 1 cent. My next problem was the dead tree. I pruned it. I had no shears, just an ordinary pair of scissors, and as I worked, one of the cemetery workers approached me and said, Mrs. Oswald, that tree is dead. We'll dig it up for you if you like. She said, Oh no, I answered. Let the tree alone, and let me see what I can do. I felt sure there was a little life left in the roots. So I went back every day for a week, morning and evening, to water the tree. It was stifling hot in Texas, but I worked anyway. And in 5 days, that dead tree, in which the television announcer found so much ironic symbolism, started to bloom. It was just love and care that transformed the symbol of shame into a symbol of beauty. Some may wonder why I take such interest in the grave. First of all, my son is buried there, and regardless of what the world says or thinks, he is still my son. I keep the grave nice, too, because of the many people who come to visit the boy's grave. I, as a mother, want these people to go back home knowing a mother's love for a son is everlasting.